I want to talk today about mitochondria. So for me to really explain how disease is generated from a bad environment, I really need to get you to understand what a mitochondrion is, what mitochondria are and what their role is, and just some basic stuff so you can understand where I'm coming from, because most of the disease process is mediated through the mitochondria, and also our wellness and our recovery will be mediated through the mitochondria. They are really the most important thing in the cell. That's where all of the quantum mechanics and the physics of light interacts with water and creates this fucking incredible thing we call life. It really is all down to these special little organelles. They're actually bacteria, so they originated as bacteria, and what we believe to happen is that these little mitochondria, these little bacteria, merged with a bigger bacteria, and the bigger bacteria used the mitochondria, used the bacteria as a slave to make it energy. And that's how, for the first time in like the history of evolution, we were able to go from just bacteria all over the earth, and it couldn't get to the next stage, complex life. It couldn't get to the next stage of evolution until this happened, and using another bacteria inside it as a cooperative slave meant that the bigger bacteria could concentrate on building more of itself and building more complex structures, which is why bacteria are so tiny and they've never evolved. But what had to happen was two bacteria merged together to create what we are now. So the cells that we have in us, in the insects, the birds, all the mammals, all the eukaryotic cells, come from a merger of two prokaryotic cells, which is like bacteria, simple organisms. So they could only clone themselves, they could never reproduce or combine. That's what makes us different. We combine, our cells actually combine together, like the sperm and the egg, we to form new cells and create a mixture of two cells to build something completely new. It's really fucking incredible. If you want to read more about this, get the books by Nick Lane. He's the University of London head of biochemistry and evolution and stuff. He's fucking incredible. His book is hard work. It's very complex stuff, but if you can follow it and you're into your science, you're a bit of a geek, that is a really good book to read. So you've got oxygen, how he explains how oxygen is the molecule that basically that made the world, that made life. The other one is The Vital Question, why is life the way it is? And that is one of the best books I've ever read. It's quite complex, but it really explains everything I'm about to explain now is in that book, and better, a lot more detail, but everything in there is what I'm about to tell you for free. So yeah, basically mitochondria are the slaves in our cells that make us energy, and there's about, depending on the cell, blood cells have none, but most of our tissues, especially the brain and the heart, have huge amounts of mitochondria. That is because the more mitochondria we have in a tissue, it means the more energy is required for the tissue. So bone has a lot, obviously muscle has a lot. We need a lot of mitochondria in muscle. 10% of our whole body is mitochondria. So 10% of our cells, of our tissue, is dedicated to making energy. And so what I've done here, I'm going to check that you can see this. So I've made, can you see this? Yes, you can. You should be able to see that. Okay. So what I've done is I've made a little, I've made this little drawing, this little sort of thing here. It's a bit shit, I'll be honest, but it explains a mitochondria and what they are. So they're called mitochondrion. So one of them, we call a mitochondrion, if you remember Star Wars Episode 1, when they're talking about why Anakin Skywalker has got so much energy and so much power in the Force, they say his midichlorians are really they've never seen so many midichlorians in the body. So what they're saying there is a Star Wars word for mitochondria, because he had so much energy in his body. He had huge amounts of electrical and powerful energy in his body, and that's how they knew he was the chosen one. Equally, I believe that the more mitochondria and the better your mitochondria are, the stronger you will be, and the healthier you will be. Everything for me comes down to these. These are so fucking important to your health, it's unbelievable. So they're the energy factory of the cell. They're where we make oxidants, or free radicals. So when you talk about antioxidants and eating vitamins and stuff, we eat those to bind to the oxidants or the free radicals that these mitochondria make. So most people don't know much about that. They know that free radicals are bad or oxidants are bad and we need more antioxidants. However, we use these oxidants, as I've explained in a different video about why you shouldn't supplement. We use these oxidants. It's actually the signal the mitochondria makes when we're losing energy and the mitochondria isn't doing as good as it should. The oxidants, the free radicals, that pulse, that release of free radicals that happens, is actually a signal to the mitochondria to improve. So that's how the mitochondria can self-regulate itself. That's why they're so fucking incredible. They're so responsive to the environment. And also, no one ever asks why the free radicals are generated in the first place. I want to get into that a little bit today. But why they're generated is very, very key to this whole story about health and disease. Okay, I'm going to turn this off because I keep looking at it. Hopefully you can see this. I'm just going to stay here. So they have their own DNA. So they have their actual own genome, which is, it all comes from your mother. So if you're watching this, it's every single mitochondria you've got in your body comes from your mom. And that's how we can track it. We can track these DNA, and we've gathered samples. So this is how we know your mitochondrial haplogroup or haplotype. This basically means we can look back at your mitochondrial DNA and see which regions of the world you're matched to. So I think if you're a K type, you're from Africa, and if you're a B type, you're from Europe or something like that. So they've got all these little names. So I'm not going to go into that today, but that tells us where our actual best environment is, where we've actually come from. So it tells you your ancestry. If you're black, I almost guarantee your mitochondria are probably from the equator, because you know that anyway because you're black. But it's always good to know, because maybe your mother was white, maybe she was from a different, you've got an Asian ancestry or something like that. So that environment might actually be might be your perfect environment. You can get this done with 23andMe. They do the ancestry test, and they tell you your maternal, and also they can tell you your dad's mom's mitochondria, so you know what your dad's mitochondria, because you obviously haven't got any of those, but it might be good to know where his is from. I don't know why, actually. I just want to know where my mum's from. I've just bought her the 23andMe test, actually, and we're going to find out where she's from. So therefore, it's a good way to assess ancestry. It's called haplotype, and there's between several hundred and 10,000 per cell. So some of the cells have absolutely fucking loads of these things in them, constantly generating energy. Not too many in my brain today, which is why I'm not speaking properly. But a lot more in my gut, which is why I haven't got Crohn's disease anymore, because I've got better mitochondria in my gut, and I no longer have a disease there. So they're highly recognised in modern science as the key to the modern diseases that we have, especially cancer, highly linked with cancer. So basically, we have the mitochondria like this. It's got an outer membrane. Just check that you can see that. It's got, hold it up. So it's got an outer membrane here. Very, very thin outer membrane. And this is actually an inner membrane. All these, they're called cristae. All these inner lines here are actually like an inner membrane. And this is the site of energy generation in the body. And these gaps between each one are very, very tight, and I'll explain that in a minute, what the relevance of that tightness, that compactness is. But yeah, so it's the site of energy generation, the energy creation. And what we have is we have the Krebs, or the citric acid cycle, which occurs in here. And basically sugar comes from the outside. And or fat. It comes in, it gets broken down into pyruvate outside. And if you've got cancer, you basically only break down glucose, which generates a little bit of energy. It's called fermentation or glycolysis. It breaks down sugar outside this the mitochondria in the cell, and it never actually goes into the cell. So that's why cancer is associated with mitochondrial dysfunction, because in cancer you lose the ability to use the electron chain transport, which is this thing here, and we often see a Warburg shift metabolism, which means that you shift the sugar. This is why people said the ketogenic diet would be good for cancer, but we know that's not strictly true anymore, and it can be quite dangerous. Although sometimes it can be very, very effective, because you're basically starving the cancer cell of glucose, because that's the only fuel. Well, it's not exactly true, like I said, but we thought it was the only fuel they could use. They wouldn't be able to use fats or ketones. Turns out they can. So basically, in a normal person, the glucose would get broken down into pyruvate, and pyruvate gets transported into the matrix and into the citric acid cycle here. And it's basically just enzymes, about 5 or 6 enzymes, and they rip the electrons and the protons off of the glucose or anything, and they take the carbon. So the carbon gets pulled off, and the carbon gets emitted as carbon dioxide, which is why you breathe out. And sorry, what was I saying? And the electrons and the protons get pulled off, and they get put into NADH. NADH is here, yeah, and it basically pulls electrons and protons in this cycle, and the cycle keeps going round and round and round. But we're extracting the electrons and protons, bringing them down here, and then the electrons get sent in pairs along this. See where the green line is? They get sent along this this chain. And they go from complex 1 to complex 3, because complex 2 is where fats go in, so that's not shown on here. So we go complex 1, with sugar we go complex 1 to 3, in between we've got some transporters, and then we go to 4, and then from 4 the electrons move down off the complex. They finish with these enzymes here, and they end here, and they bind with H+, and basically as the electrons move through the complex, these enzymes pump the protons up, and we end up with a huge amount of protons all the way over here. So it ends up being like a reservoir. You can imagine like water being pumped up here, and then as it comes down, the protons come down this final sort of turbine here called the ATPase. And that's an enzyme that generates ATP, which is what we use for energy. So every time I move my hand or my fingers, I'm using ATP there as our energy currency. So as this head here, this turbine spins, it binds ADP and a phosphate to make ATP. And it also breaks ATP down into ADP and P when we don't need as much energy, so it's reversible, so it's quite clever. The way this thing spins is that the protons move through. So as the protons move through, so protons are being pumped up here, and they start to trickle through, and they basically turn this motor around and around and around. So this is how life generates this incredible fucking proton gradient, it's called. So the electrons moving from complex to complex to complex is what changes the conformation of these enzymes and allows the protons to go through. They get pumped through. So the electrons we need as electricity to generate this proton gradient, and when we get enough protons here and not enough protons here, the proton will move through the ATPase to get back into the area where there's not many. This is often how these are called gradients we use in science. So if you're still fucking with me, you can probably tell this is pretty fucking complex, pretty incredible stuff. But there's some key things to remember here, that this is a theory, and it was heavily disregarded many years ago. But it's only a theory, and there's more science coming out now and saying that that it's not so much about the gradient, but the fact that the electrons move through here, and at the end they bind to the H plus that comes down, and they bind to the to oxygen. So oxygen is what's pulling the electrons across this chain. This is why you need to breathe oxygen, because you're constantly breathing in and pulling electrons across this membrane, because electrons really want to bind to oxygen. Oxygen is very, very electronegative. It's very magnetic and reactive. So the electrons are desperate to bind to it, and oxygen is used to pull them across this chain to pump the protons. But just as they bind to oxygen, the protons also bind to oxygen, and we get a H plus or a hydrogen atom that binds to oxygen. We get H2O. So we actually make our own water every time we do this process. This is why we don't have to drink fucking 80 kilos of water a day, because we're actually constantly generating water ourselves. And water is very, very key in all these little spaces here. And this is what I wanted to get into, was that we're actually finding out now that the protons don't necessarily come down the final ATPase because there's a gradient, but actually because there's a network of water, very, very as tight and as thin as this arrow going through here, and through here and through here. There's a network of water that in those tight spaces they become like very long molecules of water that can actually carry proton currents, proticity. So this is electricity with the electrons moving across as like a current. They're moving in a flux, in a flow, and this is proticity. So we actually, the very top level science now is saying that they're moving through these because of the water that's there. So water is very, very fucking important in a mitochondria. And we also know that if the distance between these transporters and complexes is more than about 14 angstroms, which is very, very, very small, the electrons will fall off, and they will bind to oxygen. Like maybe one of these electrons, two are going through, so maybe one will fall off because the distance is too big between these complexes, and will bind to oxygen, and then it will have one unpaired electron, and that then becomes a free radical. A free radical is where we've got an unpaired electron in oxygen in its outer shell, and this means it wants to get that electron paired. It becomes very, very reactive when that happens, and this is how oxygen can become a free radical and move to different parts of the cell, or even around here to the mitochondria itself, and rip electrons from these enzymes, and it can rip it from other areas in the cell if it's not contained. Now we take vitamins, and we take vitamins and antioxidants to bind to oxygen and to bind to the oxidants and free radicals to basically put the fire out. Vitamins donate electrons. That's why vitamins are known to be good. But I want to know why that distance is increasing. Why are they falling off? Now, to me, the structure of water in and around this area is very, very important to why these complexes will be stretched out. So when water is under infrared or UV light, when it has those frequencies present, it actually becomes structured water and becomes more dense and tighter. So this means that because this is constantly making H2O, so this whole area is surrounded by water. So the more dense and more structured the water is, the better our electron flow is. And also, the water that's around here, the more structured it is, the more these protons and this proticity will occur. So we have better energy generation, and we generate less free radicals, and we have a better redox potential. And the redox potential is essentially the negative charge in your mitochondria. So the more electrons you have, the more negative the mitochondria will be. So that's why a redox potential is very, very important in the studies at the moment, in the research, because they're trying to figure out why disease is being generated. However, these scientists don't know that water changes under UV and infrared light. Now, this spinning head that generates ATP that I spoke about, this can, when it's spinning, it's generating heat. That is a synonym for infrared light. So this is how, the faster this spins, the more the water becomes structured, the better the efficiency of the transport chain, meaning the faster this can spin. It's like a vicious circle, but it's a good circle, because that's exactly what you want. You want that really good electron flow. You don't want to be generating free radicals. So yeah, that's just a little bit of an intro to mitochondria and what they are and what they do. I'm trying to think if I've missed anything. No, I think I'll leave it there. But yeah, that is mitochondrial biochemistry and a little bit of biophysics for you, just in a nutshell. So this is why it's very important to get sunlight, infrared and UV frequencies hitting your surfaces, getting into your mitochondria and your eyes and your skin, and basically improving the structure of the water, improving the energy efficiency. This is how the sun can reverse diseases. This is how we all feel better in the sun. We all have more energy. We all have more life, you know. And the water in our eyes, when we look towards the sun, the exact same things happens. It becomes more structured, and it actually gives us free electrons, because it turns into exclusion zone water, which I'll talk about in another video. But all of this, the books you should read for this is The Fourth Phase of Water by Gerald Pollack. The fourth phase of water, so that's this fourth phase is the structured phase, the others being solid, liquid, gas. And a very complex book, but very good, Mae Wan Ho, Living Rainbow H2O. It's all the study about light and water. It's absolutely fucking incredible, but very, very hard to read. So yeah, this is something I'm going to refer people back to if they ever don't understand what a mitochondria is. Hopefully it was simple, hopefully you understood it, and hopefully you'll want to get outside in the sun and improve your mitochondrial efficiency and stop inflammation and disease being generated in your body. Alright, see you later.